What happens when Barack Obama's speech is interrupted with rude comments? And what happens next leaves everyone speechless. It was a day like no other. Barack Obama stood at the podium, the spotlight illuminating his poised figure as the crowd watched in awe. It was a moment of unity, the room filled with people from all walks of life, eager to hear his message of hope and resilience. His voice carried the weight of wisdom and experience, weaving a tapestry of words that spoke directly to the hearts of everyone present. The event, a celebration of young leaders and changemakers, was meant to inspire and encourage, and Obama, with his undeniable charm, seemed the perfect person to deliver that message. But then, something unexpected happened. Barely 10 minutes into his speech, just as he was beginning to dive into a story about overcoming adversity, a loud voice interrupted him. "Why don't you stop pretending, Obama?" The voice boomed from the middle of the crowd. The words sliced through the room like a knife, leaving everyone stunned. Heads turned sharply, searching for the source of the outburst. There, sitting in the middle row, was a man with an expression of defiance, his arms crossed and his face set in a glare. The silence was suffocating, as though the entire hall had collectively held its breath. Obama paused, his eyes scanning the audience until they landed on the man. For a brief moment, his smile faded, but only for a heartbeat. Then, with the calm and grace he was known for, he straightened up, adjusted the microphone, and addressed the disruption. "Well," he said with a small chuckle, "I suppose we've got something to talk about now." His words, delivered with measured confidence, broke the tension, and a ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd. The man, however, wasn't laughing. "You always talk about hope and change, but what about the real problems people are facing? Words don't pay bills." His voice was louder this time, angrier, demanding attention. People around him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do. Some whispered, others stared, and the rest waited anxiously to see how Obama would respond. For a moment, Obama said nothing, letting the words hang in the air. Then, with a thoughtful nod, he leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said, his tone serious but kind. "Words alone don't solve problems, but they can start conversations that lead to real solutions." The room was completely still, every eye fixed on him. Even the man who had interrupted seemed taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. "What's your name?" Obama asked, his question directed squarely at the man. The audience seemed surprised by the direct approach, but Obama's tone carried no hostility, only genuine curiosity. The man hesitated, then reluctantly answered, "Daniel." Obama nodded again, repeating the name as though committing it to memory. "Daniel," he said, "you've brought up a valid point, and I think it's a point worth discussing." The crowd watched in awe as Obama shifted the focus of his speech. Instead of brushing off the interruption or having the man removed, he invited Daniel to share his perspective. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone open and inviting. Daniel seemed caught off guard, but he didn't back down. "People are struggling out there," he said. "Jobs are disappearing, costs are rising, and no one seems to care about the ones who are barely getting by." Obama listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When Daniel finished, Obama took a deep breath and began to respond. He spoke not from a script, but from the heart, addressing each of Daniel's concerns with empathy and insight. He acknowledged the challenges, shared stories of individuals who had faced similar struggles, and highlighted efforts being made to create opportunities and provide support. His words were powerful, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. As the exchange continued, something remarkable happened. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of unity. People started nodding in agreement, and some even clapped softly. Daniel, who had initially been so combative, started to soften, his rigid posture relaxing as he listened. By the time Obama finished, the entire room erupted into applause, not just for him but for the conversation that had unfolded. Obama turned back to the audience, his smile returning. "This is what it's all about," he said. "Real conversations, real challenges, and real efforts to make a difference. It's not always easy, and it's not always comfortable, but it's necessary." His words resonated deeply, leaving a lasting impact on everyone present. The moment was a powerful reminder of the importance of listening, understanding, and working together, even in the face of disagreement. As the event came to a close, Daniel approached Obama, his expression no longer one of defiance but of respect. "Thank you," he said quietly. Obama shook his hand and replied, "Thank you, Daniel. You spoke for a lot of people today." The crowd watched as the two exchanged a few more words before parting ways, a sense of hope and possibility lingering in the air. It was a day no one in that room would forget, a day that proved the power of dialogue and the importance of standing up for what matters. As Daniel walked away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy in the room was far from fading. People were murmuring among themselves, processing what they had just witnessed. Some were inspired, others moved, and a few looked deep in thought, reflecting on their own lives and struggles. Obama stepped off the stage, greeted by members of the organizing team and other attendees, but his focus remained on the interaction that had just unfolded. He couldn't help but wonder about Daniel's story, what had brought him to this point, and what could be done to address the concerns he had voiced so passionately. As the event wrapped up, Obama was approached by a young woman named Sarah, who had been sitting a few rows behind Daniel. Her voice was hesitant, but her eyes were determined. "Mr. Obama," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled that moment. Daniel isn't wrong, you know. A lot of us feel that way, like we're just trying to keep our heads above water, but it's getting harder every day." Obama nodded, his expression softening as he listened. "I hear you, Sarah," he said gently, "and I want to keep hearing stories like yours. It's the only way we can start finding real solutions." Sarah smiled faintly, encouraged by his sincerity. "Daniel's not a bad guy," she added. "He's just been through a lot. We all have." Obama placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, the people who speak the loudest are the ones who felt unheard the longest," he said. His words struck a chord with Sarah, who nodded in agreement before walking away, her steps a little lighter than before. Meanwhile, Daniel had found a quiet corner of the hall, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. He hadn't expected Obama to listen to him, let alone engage with him so openly. The exchange had left him conflicted, part of him still frustrated, but another part beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As he replayed Obama's words in his mind, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The next morning, the headlines were ablaze with news of the interaction. Clips of the moment had gone viral, with people around the world weighing in on the exchange. Some praised Obama for his grace and composure, while others related deeply to Daniel's frustration. Social media was flooded with comments, discussions, and debates, with everyone sharing their own perspectives on what had unfolded. The story had struck a nerve, sparking conversations about the challenges people were facing and the need for real, meaningful change. Obama, back in his office, scrolled through some of the reactions online. He couldn't help but smile at the diversity of voices chiming in. This, he thought, was the power of dialogue. Picking up his phone, he dialed one of his team members. "Let's find a way to follow up with Daniel," he said firmly. "I want to know more about his story, and how we can help." As the day went on, Daniel received a call he never expected. A member of Obama's team reached out, inviting him to share more about his experiences and the struggles he had mentioned. At first, He was hesitant, unsure if this was some kind of publicity stunt. But deep down, he knew this was an opportunity to be heard, not just for himself but for everyone who felt like him. After a moment of contemplation, he agreed. When they met again, it wasn't on a stage or in front of cameras. It was in a modest room, just the two of them sitting across from each other. Obama listened intently as Daniel spoke, sharing his story with raw honesty. He talked about losing his job, struggling to provide for his family, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had consumed him. Obama didn't interrupt. He let Daniel pour his heart out, nodding occasionally and taking mental notes. By the end of the conversation, something had shifted. Daniel felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. And Obama, for all his experience and wisdom, felt like he had learned something new, something that would shape the way he approached the challenges ahead. "Thank you, Daniel," he said sincerely. "Your story matters. And I promise, we're going to do everything we can to make sure voices like yours are heard." Daniel looked at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he replied quietly. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. What had started as a heated interruption during a speech had transformed into a moment of connection and understanding, reminding everyone that even the loudest voices of frustration come from a place of pain, and that sometimes all it takes to make a difference is someone willing to listen. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's story began to spread far and wide. News outlets picked up the narrative, painting him as an everyman who had spoken up for millions. He became a symbol of resilience for people struggling to make their voices heard. But more importantly, his story sparked action. Local communities began organizing town hall meetings, inviting leaders to hear directly from the people about the real challenges they faced. It was as if the interruption at Obama's speech had unlocked a door that no one wanted to close. Daniel, however, still felt conflicted. The attention was overwhelming. Some praised him for his courage, while others criticized him for his approach. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the pressure weighed on him. One evening, as he sat on the worn couch in his modest living room, his phone buzzed with yet another notification. It was a clip of a town hall meeting where a young woman shared her story of working 3 jobs just to keep her family afloat. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He realized that his voice had inspired others to step forward, and for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Obama stayed true to his word. He had his team work closely with community leaders to address the concerns raised by people like Daniel. He didn't just stop at listening, he took action. Programs were launched to provide job training, financial assistance, and mental health support to struggling families. While these efforts couldn't fix everything overnight, they were a start, a step in the right direction. Obama made it a point to highlight these stories of change in his speeches, showing the world that progress was possible when people worked together. One day, Daniel received an unexpected invitation to attend a follow-up event with Obama. It wasn't a grand stage or a formal affair. It was a small gathering of people who had shared similar struggles and stories. Daniel hesitated at first, but something inside him pushed him to go. When he arrived, he was greeted warmly by the other attendees. They were from different walks of life, but their stories were strikingly similar, tales of hardship, resilience, and the desire for something better. Obama entered the room with the same calm energy he always carried. He greeted everyone personally, taking the time to listen to their names and stories. When he reached Daniel, he extended his hand with a smile. "Daniel, it's good to see you again," he said, his tone warm and genuine. Daniel shook his hand, feeling a mix of nervousness and gratitude. "Thank you for inviting me," he replied softly. As the gathering progressed, each person shared their journey, and the room became a space of vulnerability and connection. When it was Daniel's turn, He took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice wavered at first, but as he continued, it grew stronger. He spoke about his initial frustration, the weight of his struggles, and the unexpected turn of events that had brought him to this moment. By the time he finished, the room was silent, everyone absorbing his words. Obama stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Daniel," he began, "your courage to speak up that day wasn't just about pointing out a problem. It was about starting a conversation that needed to happen. And look around you. This is what happens when we listen to each other, when we come together to find solutions." The room erupted in applause, the sound filled with a sense of unity and hope. As the event came to a close, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. He realized that his voice had made a difference, not just for himself, but for others too. Walking out of the room that evening, he looked up at the sky, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant, but it was possible. And sometimes, it all started with one voice willing to speak up. As Daniel walked home that night, the streets felt different, quieter, but somehow alive with possibility. He replayed the moments from the gathering in his mind, the stories, the raw emotion, and Obama's words about the power of connection. For the first time, he began to see his struggle as more than just his own burden. It was part of something bigger, something that tied him to others in ways he hadn't understood before. His steps felt lighter, and for once, the future didn't seem as daunting. The days that followed brought more changes than Daniel could have imagined. He was invited to speak at local community meetings, sharing his story and listening to others. He had never thought of himself as a leader, but people were drawn to his honesty and his willingness to face the uncomfortable truths that many avoided. At first, he wasn't sure if he could handle it, standing in front of a room full of strangers, opening up about his struggles. But each time he saw the nods of understanding, the looks of relief when someone realized they weren't alone, it gave him the courage to keep going. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, Daniel received a call from Sarah, the young woman who had spoken to Obama after his initial outburst. She sounded excited, almost breathless, as she shared an idea she'd been working on. "Daniel," she said, "what if we started something together? A group, maybe, where people like us could come together to share resources, support each other, and work on solutions? Not just talking about problems, but actually doing something about them." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and though Daniel hesitated at first, he found himself nodding as she spoke. "Let's do it," he said finally, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. The group began small, just a handful of people meeting in the back room of a local community center. They called it Voices United, a name that reflected their belief in the power of collective action. At first, it was just about sharing stories and frustrations, but soon, it grew into something more. Members began organizing food drives, job fairs, and workshops on financial literacy and mental health. The impact was immediate, and word began to spread. People from neighboring towns started reaching out, wanting to join or replicate the idea in their own communities. Obama, hearing about the initiative, reached out to Daniel and Sarah to commend their efforts. He invited them to a larger platform where they could share their model with other leaders and organizations. Standing on that stage, Daniel felt a rush of emotions, pride, nervousness, and a deep sense of purpose. As he spoke, he saw the same spark in the eyes of the audience that had ignited in him. It wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about what people could accomplish when they came together. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were challenges along the way, disagreements within the group, setbacks in funding, and moments when the weight of it all felt too much. Daniel often found himself lying awake at night, wondering if they were really making a difference, or if it was all just temporary. But every time he saw the smiles of families receiving much-needed support or heard someone say, "Thank you for listening." It reminded him why they started. Months turned into a year, and Voices United became more than just a local initiative. It was a movement. Communities across the country adopted the model, tailoring it to their unique needs, but keeping the core idea the same, that every voice mattered and that real change began with listening and working together. Daniel and Sarah were often asked to speak at events, but they always emphasized that the credit didn't belong to them alone. "This is about all of us," Daniel would say, "about people who refused to stay silent, who believed that things could get better if we stood together." Through it all, Daniel never forgot that day at the speech, the moment that had set everything in motion. He often thought about the courage it had taken to speak up, the fear that had gripped him even as he stood his ground. And he thought about Obama's response, not just his words, but the way he had truly listened, the way he had made Daniel feel seen and heard. It was a lesson Daniel carried with him in every interaction. That change didn't come from shouting the loudest, but from listening with an open heart and acting with genuine intent. As Daniel sat one evening, watching a newscast about the growing impact of Voices United, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sarah, a simple text that read, "We're doing it, Daniel. We're really making a difference." He smiled, typing back, "Yeah, we are." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of peace, not because all the problems had been solved, but because he finally believed they could be. Daniel stared out the window of his small apartment, the city lights twinkling against the dark night sky. It had been 2 years since that fateful day when he had interrupted Obama's speech, and the course of his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. Voices United had grown beyond his wildest dreams, becoming a national force for good. Communities across the country were now connected through a network of support and action, all rooted in the simple idea that every voice deserved to be heard. But even with all the progress, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much left to do. One evening, as he sat going through emails and updates from the organization, Daniel received a call from Sarah. Her voice sounded urgent, but there was an unmistakable excitement in her tone. "Daniel, you won't believe this," she said. "We've been invited to the White House." Daniel froze, his mind racing. "What?" he managed to say, his heart pounding. "The White House? Why?" Sarah laughed, unable to contain her excitement. "Obama wants to host a summit for grassroots leaders, and he specifically asked for us to be there. He says what we've built is an example of how real change happens." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Daniel and Sarah worked tirelessly to gather stories, data, and visuals that would show the impact of Voices United. When the day finally arrived, Daniel found himself standing in front of the iconic building, a mix of awe and disbelief washing over him. Walking through the halls of the White House, he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him or Sarah. It was about everyone who had shared their stories, who had believed in the idea that their voices mattered. The summit was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Grassroots leaders from across the country filled the room, each bringing their own unique perspectives and solutions. Obama, as always, was a calming and inspiring presence, guiding the discussions with humility and wisdom. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he felt a familiar nervousness creeping in. But as he looked out at the faces in the room, he remembered why he was there. Taking a deep breath, he began to tell the story of how Voices United had come to be. Not just the successes, but the challenges, the doubts, and the countless moments when giving up had seemed easier than pressing on. The room was silent as Daniel spoke, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. When he finished, there was a long pause before the room erupted into applause. Obama stepped forward, a proud smile on his face. "This," he said, gesturing to Daniel, "is what leadership looks like. Not because it's perfect or easy, but because it's real, and because it's done for the right reasons." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat as the words sank in. He had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, and now he was being recognized on one of the most important stages in the world. As the summit continued, Daniel found himself in deep conversations with other leaders, exchanging ideas and forming connections that would strengthen their shared mission. By the end of the day, he and Sarah left the White House feeling both inspired and overwhelmed. They knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require even more effort and determination. Back home, Daniel sat in his living room, looking at the small plaque he had been given at the summit. It read, "For outstanding leadership and dedication to community." He traced the letters with his fingers, thinking about how far he had come. He thought about the people who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, and the countless others who had joined the movement because they, too, wanted to make a difference. Sarah called later that night, her voice calm but determined. "Daniel, today was amazing, but it's not the finish line," she said. He smiled, knowing she was right. "I know," he replied. "We've got more work to do." As he hung up the phone, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges ahead didn't scare him anymore. If anything, they motivated him. The journey from that heated interruption at Obama's speech to this moment had been anything but easy. But every step, every struggle, and every conversation had been worth it. Daniel had found his voice, and in doing so, he had helped countless others find theirs too. And as he sat there, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, he knew one thing for sure: the story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning.